Okay, so they wanted a Republic. Who had a question? Yeah.
Do you do a curve?
Do I do a curve?
Yeah, like on your tests.
I do serpentine sometimes. What do you mean?
Like if someone got like a 94, like make it 100, so everyone gets like a 6. Oh,
No, that's crazy talk.
you don't do that?
No.
Nonsense.
Nonsense?
Yes, that's what that would be.
Well, if you would have kept your tinfoil hat on, then you would have been able to withstand this. No, I don't curve. But actually, it wouldn't matter. There are a few 99% anyways.
Oh, that's awesome.
Who's that?
It wasn't
A
the
few-
other.
So there would be no curve anyways. But yeah. And no, there's a lot of A's and B's. You not. A few people only answered 3 short IDs. And those of you who probably know who you are, I'll give you a chance to write that one. This is like your get out of jail free card. I'll let you write that one if you did 3, but most of you did 4. And oh, and one more thing. On the first couple of tests, because I want you to get good on the essays and think about it, you're not quite used to it, I will give you the opportunity, and I'll tell you more tomorrow when I hand back the test, to redo 2 short IDs for credit. So, because there are people who did really well on 3 of them, and then got like all 15 points off on the 4th one. They made a big mistake.
So 15 points each?
Mm-hmm.
15?
15.
ID?
Oh yeah, they're big. These are big. But I'm giving you the opportunity to redo 2 for full credit to get better at them and work on them. So I will give you that. So don't worry. There's a lot of people who might have a C or B, or going to have a C or B, that if they get that, they can redo that the short ID, they get a B or A. I'm serious. And there were a lot of A's in it. I know. So get back to this. Republic is a government by representation. It is a government by representation. And they all look back to the Roman Republic. In fact, that's part of the reason why it was actually called the Republican form of architecture, but it was Roman architecture. Why you see all the columns at the United States Capitol and the White House copying Rome and the Roman Republic. And also, they desperately feared tyranny, aka a strong central government like King George. So they wanted the government to go, the form of government to go back to the states. Government to go back to the states. I'm sorry, more power to the states. And the idea being, if the states have more power, one tyrannical government on top can't enforce its will to benefit a few. And to their point of view, remember, they feared monopolies. So government creating monopolies. And there was a massive economic depression. I'll explain this more down the road, but money was just meaningless. There was no set financial system. There was obviously economic ruin, but I should also add one thing. This is still pre-capitalism. The world then would have made no sense to us. Just wouldn't have made sense. It's not capitalism yet. Capitalism is literally just being created at this moment in Britain. All the good and bad elements of it. Also, there was a real movement for democracy. A real movement. Now, when I mean democracy, I don't mean a real, true democracy where everybody decides and votes on every single thing. A democracy as in the people are, do you remember the word for power? Sovereign, sovereignty, where the people are sovereign. And also, there was a real movement for leveling. Remember egalitarian, lessening the differences between the classes. Where the thought was that we have our own power. We can make sure that the speculators and the creditors don't take advantage of us, take all the land, drive us off the land, make us become either renters or like indentured servants. And we will make this nation truly based upon liberty. Remember, I talked about liberty, where you can't be truly free unless you control your own property and not dependent upon somebody else. This is the letterhead for a newspaper in Philadelphia, and Lady Liberty, but also liberty as dressed like an American Indian. I thought that was really interesting. Remember that kind of contradiction they had. And so the first form of government was called the Articles of Confederation. You see it called the Articles or the Confederation. I call it the Articles all the time. I don't even realize I'm doing it. And then sometimes I'll say the Confederation. They're synonymous, Articles or Confederation. You also see them called the Confederacy, but I think for obvious reasons, if you look at history, you know what I'm talking about. That one, it gets even more confusing. If I do that, I'm sorry, but I mean, Articles means the Articles of Confederation. I don't even know I'm doing it. I just say articles, and I mean Articles of Confederation. And it was created in 1777. 1781, it became the de facto government. Beautiful. But in reality, it didn't become the full government until 1783 with the Treaty of Paris. And jump right out. This one's out.
Wait, so it became the government in 1781 or 1783?
You go and put 1783. It was technically the government, but in reality, they got to wait to the Treaty of Paris. That's the big thing. And to make sure the government would not be, to make sure that these new states that are worried about losing power won't lose power, each state gets one vote. A legacy of that exists with today's government. What part of the United States legislature does each state have the equal number of representatives? Yeah.
House of Representatives?
What's the other one? House or the what? Every state has 2 senators. The House is by population. Every state has to have at least 1. But that's by population. Every state has 2 senators. For Montana senators. John Tester's 1. He's running for re-election, and I doesn't look good for him. Who's the other one? Steve Daines. And if she wins, pretty much everybody who represents Montana will then will be from, well, we're not Montanans. They moved into the state. Really interesting. So each state has 1 vote. Now they can send as many members to their delegation as possible. Pennsylvania sent a bunch, but they all will have to. Their vote all equals only 1 vote. So each state gets 1, and it requires 9 votes to pass a law. A supermajority. It requires 13 votes to amend it, to change it, meaning every state has to agree. So if you need a supermajority,
How many states were there at this time?
13. The 13 original colonies, that's it. What kind of laws are passed? It requires 9. What kind of laws? Will there be any laws passed? Nothing is passed. What is passed? Almost no law. Anything controversial, all you need is 5 states and it's gone. Nothing is passed. This Congress has no, or has almost no ability to pass a law. It's dysfunctional. Does that remind you of any legislative body? The United States now. Our Congress is completely and totally dysfunctional. It passes nothing. Heck, they barely passed a budget last night to keep the government going for 3 months. 6 months ago, they barely passed a bill to pay our bills, or we could have gone default on all our debts, and the financial system of the world would have collapsed. They barely passed it 6 months ago. They can pass nothing. Why? The supermajority. The Senate decided in their own rules, this is not in the Constitution, they decided in their own rules that it requires, well, how many Senate members of the Senate are there? Huh? 100. It's not a majority to pass laws in the Senate. Almost all laws in the Senate require 60 votes. They require a supermajority. That's Senate rules, a supermajority. So what gets passed? All it requires is 41 members of the Senate to stop anything. So what's passed?
Nothing.
Nothing. We don't pass anything. Nothing is passed. And so we have a similar thing right now. If you look at this, you say, wow, there's problems, and the government didn't seem to address the problems. I just told you why. Nothing is passed. Could the Senate change the rules? Yes. Will they? Minority runs things. The majority is not counted. Back to this. So the point is, the more things change, you notice how I connected the past to today? And we nearly had a revolution to get this system. You notice how I did that? Nothing stays stationary. There are reasons things happen. It also explains part of the reason why so many people are frustrated with the government. They don't really know about the filibuster. That's what it's called, the 60 vote margin. And they get mad and frustrated, and I don't know. We have polls where 40% of the American public say that we should have a dictatorship today. And on that note, you're out of here, right? And you have to read anytime before you have to do the quiz. The quiz will be Monday, don't worry. Okay, sit. So there's no one to carry out laws. They didn't want a tyrant. They didn't want a tyrant like King George III. The executive is the person that carries out the laws. And the executive has immense power. Power beyond almost any comprehension. Because Congress passes laws, but it's just a written, usually very hard to read, hard to decipher, written law, and they get to decipher it. Wow, is that power? Who's the executive today? All of you know who the executive is, I hope. Yeah, who's the president? Joe Biden. Who's the executive of the state of Montana? Greg Gianforte, the governor. We do live in the capital. So, they are the executive. Immense power. Don't have it. So who carries it out? The states? What if the states don't want to? There's no one to force them. So even if they pass the law, nothing happens. So this is an incredibly weak system. Now, one thing I will say, Congress is completely dysfunctional, but the executive does have a lot of power. I'll explain that next week. And a few more things. Do they have the power to tax then? No. The states have to collect any taxes, and will the states collect it? No. In fact, there is talk about an impost tax, a tariff. And it went nowhere because they couldn't pass Congress, they couldn't get the 9 votes, and then when it did, the states wouldn't collect it. If you can't tax, you can't have a government. If you can't tax, you don't have a financial system. Everything collapses. Governments that can't collapse lead to direct ruin, economically, politically, period. So, governments can't borrow money then. Who the heck would ever buy a bond from the United States if they can't tax? And what do they have to do to get people to buy bonds? If no one's going to buy it, how do you sweeten the pot, so to speak? What do you? Yeah, increase interest rates. That means the interest rates keep going up, and that means you have more to pay back down the road. But if you can't tax, how do you pay it back? It's a crisis. I mean, that's why when I mentioned that the government just about shut down, or the government about didn't pay its debt 6 months ago, and which just was mind-boggling. We got that close. All it would take is a couple days of not collecting taxes, and the entire country would collapse. The entire financial system. Because your dollar would mean nothing. Yeah, there's always some yay who, yeah!
I'm being sarcastic.
Yeah. I'll be roaming the streets with a spear taking from people. Survival of the fittest. What? Moving on. And therefore they can't control the money supply. If a government can't tax, they can't control the money supply. If you can't control the money supply, you do not have an economic system. We become Somalia, which has no government and no financial system. So basically, our routine of we need to go purchase necessities, we need to go buy food at the store, would become a negotiation because money has no value. It'd be incomprehensible. So therefore, there's no currency. Even if they put out US currency, no one trusted the value. And then every state put out their own currency. So the currency has no value, or they just can't issue it. And so it's just this negotiation. And what about inflation or deflation? They can't control it. They can't control. It's up to the states. So you have basically 13 separate little economies and then little economies within the state. I mean, think about this one. It'd be like if we were in Helena and then we went to Missoula and the money we use in Helena didn't work. We're in Missoula and what do? And there's no set way to exchange, so I guess we just stay in Helena.
Or we with
Huh?
or we steal things.
That's kind of what's going to happen. Whoever's the biggest and strongest will take. But, real fast, today, we don't have full control over the money supply, but what branch of the United States government controls inflation and deflation? I've told you this once before. The Federal Reserve. And last week they cut interest rates because, the economy is very strong. Right now, it's very strong right now. It can collapse, the labor market can collapse really quick. So they're trying to do a preemptive strike last week, and they cut interest rates by 50%. The interest rates that the bank charges, the Federal Reserve charges to loan to other banks. If you cut the interest rates, it makes it easier to pump money into the economy, raising the money supply. So, foreign policy. The executive speaks for foreign policy. Now you have 13 states. They're actually negotiating treaties with other places, not just with places like Spain or Britain, but also with the woodland nations. They're negotiating with them. And what about treaties? Remember the Treaty of Paris said that New Orleans has to be open as a port? You think Spain is going to listen to this 13-headed Hydra monster? Hydra is a many-headed Greek monster. And no, or for that matter, how do you negotiate trade? What is a tax on imports called? A tariff. You had 13 individual states who were putting tariffs, not just on other countries, but other states. And if there's any kind of problem, there's no armed forces. The executive branch of the United States government today is where the military is. The president, in times of war, is commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Don't have that. So what do you have? You have no standing army. All you have are individual state militias. And just like taxes, can't they do whatever they want? This would actually be a real crisis in the War of 1812. The New York State said, we're not going to let you use our militia. The militia stood and watched the small U.S. Army get routed by a British-Canadian force. They just sat on a hill and watched it. No federal court system. So you have 13 individual state courts, but what happens if there's a problem between states? Or a problem with one person in New York and one person in Philadelphia? How do you deal with this? There's no final court of appeals, and there's no court to be the final adjudicator of laws. And then the best example of this is New York and Connecticut. All these problems came to a head with these two states. New York and Connecticut were trading rivals. Okay, New York was a much bigger port, but New Haven was pretty big too. What does a cobbler make? Shoes. New York cobblers were trying to reestablish themselves. But Britain was beginning the Industrial Revolution, more organized, and British merchants were bringing in shoes into New York. It's called dumping, bringing in a bunch of shoes. What happens to the price of shoes if all of a sudden a bunch of new shoes were coming in? Tanks. New York was mad. So they put a tariff on New York, put a tariff on Britain. Okay. So what did Britain do? They sent the shoes to New Haven, and then they just shipped it over to New York, same thing. So New York put a tariff on Connecticut. Connecticut put a tariff on New York. They can't sue each other, so New York sent militia to block the border. Connecticut sent militia in response, and the next thing you know, they went to war over shoes and tariffs. Okay, if two states go to war today, if Montana and North Dakota goes to war today, I think we could take it. But we go to war. What would the federal government do today? Huh? Sit back and watch the fun. No, they would stop it. Arizona and California nearly went to shots between their respective state police over water 2 years ago. There was a face-off over Colorado River water. hey, they live in a desert. Water is becoming a crisis down there. They almost started shooting each other. California wanted to open up the canal that would connect the Colorado to Los Angeles. And Arizona said, no, our farmers get it. And they almost shot each other. It's just 2 years ago. The Biden administration sent down federal marshals, and now they're supposedly working on a plan that's gone nowhere. Who knows? Maybe next year. But we can have a good fight. Do you see the problem? I think we can take it. The only problem we have is we have 100 Minuteman III ICBMs. They have 100 Minuteman III ICBMs. You see a problem. What's a Minuteman III ICBM? Yeah?
So your continental ballistic missile that can have in 2 minutes?
It's just a ballistic missile. Yeah. That has a 100-kiloton nuclear weapon. Have you gone to Great Falls? They're all over up there. Huh? Wyoming has 102 and a big Air Force base. We have a tiny Air Force base that only has transports. North Dakota has more Air Force bases too, and mine not. It'd be close, but they're North Dakotans. All right, back to this. So the government is absolutely inadequate. Minuteman III. You get the term? They could fire in a minute's notice. So, Western lands will be the first crisis. And ironically, it's one of the few places where the Articles of Confederation would come up with kind of a solution, but this kind of a solution is still the law today. So the Constitution just kept the laws. Everything else, completely worthless. So, states had competing land claims. All these competing land claims. And they're all in massive amounts of debt. All these bonds. So what they thought is if we sell our land, we could use that to pay off our bonds. But the federal government wants to do the same thing too. And all this land went to the United States in the Treaty of Paris. And don't forget all these speculators who want to go in there. They need stable governments to buy this land now, scoop it up, steal it from the people living there, and sell it for a profit. So they're obsessed, and the speculators have great influence. I've already told you, the most prominent of these speculators who had just almost an obsession with getting rich was George Washington. So, a lot of influence. And here's the deal. There's also squatters. Who was the most famous squatter who sat right here in what is now Kentucky? Do you remember that guy? Crossed the Cumberland Gap? Yeah. Yeah, Daniel Boone. And they just took the land from the people living there, and they said, I don't care about your legal claim, we're not leaving. Kentucky's like this weird gray area then. Well, what do we do about that? Well, in 1785, one more thing I almost forgot. The union of all these areas could break down if the West isn't organized. And that was a fear that would go on. They would be talking about this well into the 1840s, about the West breaking away from his own country. What great technological advancement would happen in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s that was connecting East to the West. Yeah. Good get. And the telegraph would be important, but moving goods. Railroads, yeah. So, the Land Ordinance of 1785 would pass the God. And this one is not that controversial of a law, but it's still a pretty big deal. Pretty big deal. States gave up their claims. And we'll get to that, how they did. There's debt issues, but they would survey all the federal land. So they sent teams of surveyors out, which had to be remarkable people, which I should add, the woodland nations were like, what the heck? Should we allow them in? Looking back, they shouldn't have. But all that, so they could sell later. And then they would divide it up into 6x6 townships, 6x6 miles. Then every township would have 36 sections of 1 by 1. And they would survey every place that would be federal land. And so that means all this area. But if you ever look at a land ownership map of Montana, it's all squares. Because it's all sections and townships. It's all little squares. Looks like a checkerboard. So places that didn't have federal land, they're not surveyed like this. Like the 13 colonies, they were before the 13 original states, they were before the US. Texas doesn't. Texas was an independent country and then was annexed into the United States in 1845. So Texas isn't like this either, but Montana is. In fact, you get a state like Iowa that's flat, so it's all been divvied up into these little squares. The whole state is square. Every road runs either east, west, north, south. Every county's a square. It's actually kind of funny to look at, just all square, because it's flat, so you can really do it. One more thing too. This was the practice. It would become law 20 years later. Money from the sale of one section will go to education. And this would begin this idea in the United States. We didn't invent, but it would become synonymous with the United States. That the people of the United States will provide public education, at least limited public education, as in eventually it does end. Now, other nations would do this and pass the United States and the availability of education. And public education is under major attack now. But it's something that we've just all taken advantage of. And it's been an amazing gift. I know you might not see it because it's almost like a job for you. But if you could just step out of the fact that you got to do work in here and think about what life would be like if you didn't have that, it'd be pretty terrifying. But if you go to other countries, they now provide almost free or tuition for college, for example. That almost happened. Thankfully, that's gone. That's me being a little bit facetious. I'm sorry. You will find out. You already know my guesses about college, right? So if you're thinking about that or any other education. But it's a big deal. So where did they go first? Ohio. This little section right here. So there's a lot of pictures of the little townships. And they surveyed it. Actually, it's kind of remarkable what they did. And then here's this township, the sections. They thought the perfect size for a farm would be a quarter section, 160 acres. That's way too small in the West. It's too small now, but that's what they thought. So that's the Northwest Ordinance, or I'm sorry, that's the land Ordinance of 1785. Now let's go back and talk. They also need governments. And so what kind of government would they make? A proposed ordinance of 1784 would be done by Jefferson. Jefferson was in Paris as the ambassador to the United States. I'm sorry, ambassador to France from the United States. Which, by the way, had to be a hard job because who are you speaking for if you're the ambassador to the Articles of the Confederation? Jefferson, though through France, proposed we need to organize this into 14 states. Yes, this would have been Transylvania. And 14 states with no slave codes. No slave codes in any of these new states west of the Appalachians. No slave codes. Slavery cannot function without the slave codes. Without the slave codes. So they can't function without this. And here's the thing about slave codes. A couple things. First off, states without slave codes soon will be known as, and you've probably heard this terminology before, free states. Doesn't mean anything's free, it just means they don't have slave codes. Slave states have slave codes. It's all about slave codes. All those laws. And don't forget, the most important of the slave codes was the fornication laws. If you did a short idea on the fornication laws and didn't mention slave codes, you lost points. The slave codes would not be solidified, made into law until Bacon's Rebellion. So if you ID'd Bacon's Rebellion and didn't mention slave codes, you lost points. And if you did racism, which I just threw out there, and didn't mention slave codes, because racism comes from slave codes, you lost points. Not a lot on some, more on others. And like I said, I'll give you a chance to rewrite 2 of them. But these are the most important elements of slavery, and therefore racism comes from the slave codes. This is a big deal. And by the way, by me saying that, I've noticed some people kind of looking around, and some are like, got it. And a few people like, I'm sorry. But I really talked about that when I went over in class.
What if we didn't do slave codes, but we talked about fornication laws?
If you talked about it enough where I could see that you're going in the slave codes and described it, you got most of them. So you should be fine. But if you just mention, I did notice it looked like some people like quick went on the internets and looked up Bacon's Rebellion on the list. And boy, are you going to be suffering. Because the internet is just, they have so much, this might shock you, really bad information on US history. Shockingly bad, especially if you look on like the Google, and the Google gives you, what do they call their AI?
Oh, yeah.
It's just a total joke. I mean, it's so bad. It's so bad. I mean, I guess you can do it like a, you know, but for history, that's, but you already probably knew that. Some of you are like, I know now. Okay. But to Jefferson, slavery equaled tyranny. And he knew the republic would fall apart if there was slavery. You can't have free speech if you have slavery. You can't have democracy if there's slavery. Because if free people say anything against slavery, that might trigger a slave rebellion or enslave people to run away. Slavery, by definition, is tyranny for all. Yeah, I know there's worse tyranny for the slaves than free people, but everybody has got to be controlled and it has to operate as a police state. And Jefferson knew the republic cannot survive. So that's why Jefferson wanted slavery. But he was also hoping if we made these into, I'll just use the term free states, even though that wasn't quite used yet, it will be, slavery will go away sometime down the road. Sometime down the road, meaning probably after who's dead? Jefferson. You get the point on that? I'll set the stage, but I'll still lead my nice life. Good luck. Well, did it pass? Our entire course of history would have been different. And I don't know how, if this would have passed. Anybody want to guess the states that voted against it? Shall we start? New York. Put your head down. Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland. The biggest slave states. So much like the filibuster in the Senate, all it took is a minority to stop that. So now a compromise is going to come. The Land Ordinance of 1787, but everybody calls it the Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance. Compromise. Well, first off, if we need governments, are they going to be colonies? Will they be an empire? Once they get 5,000 people, that means citizens of the United States, and that did not include the woodland nations. Citizens of the United States, 5,000 people would become a territory. So Montana became a territory. Anybody know when? 1864. 60,000 people, it would become a state. They knew that as low, and by the 1840s, this is remarkably low. But that's still the law today. When did Montana become a state? 1889. Who said? Did you say it?
Well, I said it for one of the kids.
Oh, you got it. Yeah. If you go in the Capitol, look at the Capitol building in the rotunda, it says 1889. We came with a whole bunch of states. I'll tell you about why that happened down the road. All politics. I'll tell you why there's 2 Dakotas. And so, when was the last state? 1959. Hawaii and Alaska came. 1959. For some reason, Puerto Rico is more than big enough. Puerto Rico, everyone who lives there are American citizens, but they're not a state. And Puerto Rico has a heck of a lot more people than Montana. And District of Columbia is not a state. So, back to this. The 5 states north of the Ohio would be the first ones organized. Kentucky was already organized, but remember the squatters? And they would be no slave codes. And by definition, they set up a sectional divide. By law, they set up that sectional divide. How about like polyphonemia too? What's sectional divide? Let's look at it. If there's going to be no slave codes, so no one can really bring in their slaves to these 5 states, what about these states? If there's no slave codes here, it implies what will be here. Did everyone catch this? So that's what you have to get. By implication, the southern states will be slavery, about slave cards. And therefore, you now have a sectional divide. North, south, right there. Yes, it existed before, but it's kind of a gray area still because they started as colonies, but now the Ohio River would be that line. And it would go and then to the Mississippi, 4 slaves, 5 free. And just like when Jefferson tried to blame King George for slavery, and once again an effort to do something about the spread of slavery, they knew slavery could potentially destroy the Republic, and it almost did. A number of times. So people started, speculators started rolling in Ohio. There's going to be the myth of party frontiersmen, settlers moving in. Of course, remember, they're going to steal the land. But the big thing is the speculators sort of coming in. But I love this for the Ohio. But the point is, not really. Because the whole financial system was in shambles. And it all stems from the money supply. And I can't emphasize the money supply enough. This is everything. The money supply. And it affects different people, especially classes, differently. So, we all know inflation, deflation, value of money. Which one is the value of the money going up? Inflation, deflation. Value of money goes up. Is it here or here? You got a 50-50 shot. Value of money going up is deflation. Value of money going down is inflation. Which one are prices going to go up? Inflation, because your money doesn't buy as much. So, creditors, those who loan, those who make money off of interest, and then debtors. Now, there's a lot of speculators, and a lot of people with a lot of money, they all borrow money too. But by definition, is there going to be more wealth in the hands of the creditor or the debtor? More wealth in the hands of the creditor or the debtor? Which creditor loans money, the debtor borrows? Yeah, the creditor has more wealth. They have to, by definition. They're loaning. They have to. Does inflation help the creditor or the debtor?
Creditor.
The debtor. A lot. Okay, think about it for a second. Let's say I borrow $100. No, don't even worry about interest. I just borrow $100. And I have to pay it back. I have to pay it back in a year. And there's inflation. What happens to the value of the money of that $100 a year later when I pay it back?
It goes down.
It goes down. Did you catch that? So the debtor pays back money of lesser value. So you wrote that down, I'm happy for you. But if you didn't know that the creditor is hurt by inflation and the debtor is helped, make sure you jot that down. You didn't know that. That's why you didn't know. That's why we're here. And we wrote it down to be easier to remember. So I don't have to, this is what I just mentioned. Money supply affects everything. To this day. Back to this. Deflation. You see why the creditor likes things like deflation. No inflation. Just $100. No interest. I pay back that $100 a year later, and what happens to the value of that money? If there's deflation,
Goes up.
it goes up. I lost wealth. The creditor gained wealth. Just imagine if you had interest to it. One more thing. So we know what interest is, right? Would interest rates go up in inflation or deflation? Interest is that basically that's additional money you're kind of paying extra to borrow money. Would interest go up with inflation or deflation? With inflation. When inflation goes up, interest rates go up. Maybe not a lot, maybe a little. If inflation goes up a lot, then interest rates go up because banks aren't making money. One more thing about it. Let's say you have wealth. You have $1 million. Let's go with $1 million. I know for today that's nothing. That's pocket change for you guys today. But just imagine $1 million. Who has $1 million on them right now? And you decide, I'm going to put it in a jar and bury it in my backyard. Right? Safest place to deal with money, correct?
Absolutely. Sure.
Do you want inflation or deflation?
Deflation.
Huh? Deflation. You don't have to do anything. If there's deflation, you wait a year, you dig that jar out, and you've made wealth. If you have inflation, your wealth goes away. So, debtors, small farmers, they like a little bit of inflation. Too much inflation is bad for anyways because of interest rates. But inflation does help. Inflation means wages gone up. Real wages have gone up in the last 3 years because of the inflation. In fact, wages have gone up more than prices. We just don't notice it because we're so shocked by prices because we've had no inflation for so long, your whole life until recently. I lived through 20% inflation in the 70s, so I remember that. But that also tells you one more thing about me. I'm ancient. So, here's the deal. With all these different currencies, the value of all these currencies are dropping like a rock. But specie, remember that's where you have the value within the coin? That's going up. So you basically just have this multiple layer of money. You just have to go and negotiate. Nobody knew what anything was worth. How can you plan for the future? And this is the thing. The market cannot function. The buying and selling of goods, the setting of prices for anything from farm commodities to iron goods cannot exist unless the money supply is secure. Unless the money supply is secure. Can't pass, all this falls apart. Because the future becomes meaningless because you can't plan for it. That's actually a really terrifying feeling. And so, if the market can't function, the future, there's too much risk. And therefore, no one's investing in it. They're not investing in shit. They're not investing in new farms. Speculators are scared to invest. People are scared to move out into the farm. People are leaving and trying to squat in Kentucky. The whole thing's falling apart. No foreign nations are thinking, hey, let's go sell our goods here because we don't know what anything's worth. The future is important. And we have to have some idea of the future. That means we need that stable history and financial system. Yeah, that's why it was such a big deal 6 months ago when Republicans in Congress were seriously thinking about going default to punish the Democratic president. And that would have risked our entire financial system. And it was Republicans again just yesterday that voted against the budget. So a few Republicans in power and Democrats voted to keep the budget going. It's very, 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 very political. Last thing. You can always tell who runs the country on the money supply. If you have a government that wants inflation, you can tell who runs the country. Wants a little bit of inflation. If you have a country that's radically against inflation, so more deflationary, you can tell who runs the country. Who runs the country? What kind of people if they want deflationary policies? Yeah. Yeah, the wealth. Yeah. You can always tell. You can just, boom, you can tell who's in charge. Who runs our country? We are anti-inflation. And by the way, if you're a Republican and Democrat, you can agree or disagree with those programs, but that's what happened. So we'll take a few of these off. James, why do you hate America? Coming to fit the shape of the big deal. And oh yeah.
So I'm like, okay, and I said, okay, I'm just gonna.
Let me do that right. Got it done? Very good. Shades of rebellion and that couldn't be on my list. Sound good? Did you look online and go to the Well, come here. Come on. I'm gonna give it to you. Okay, what? Okay, now are you on? Okay, so you can be checking home. You didn't finish your thing again.